August 26, 1346. On a rain-soaked field near the village of Crecy in northern France, 9,000 exhausted English soldiers braced themselves against 30,000 of Europe's finest warriors. Across the valley stands the pride of medieval civilization, armored knights, warhorses plated in steel, banners of princes, dukes, and kings snapping in the wind. The French host is so confident of victory that nobles argue over who will earn the honor of killing the English king. For hours later, the field is carpeted with corpses. More than 1,500 French nobles are dead, princes, counts, dukes, even kings. The English have lost 40 men, not 400. 40. In a single afternoon, 5 centuries of armored dominance collapse into mud, blood, and rain, destroyed by peasants wielding nothing but bent wood and string. The blind king of Bohemia rides willingly into the storm of death. French knights trample their own soldiers in their rush for glory. Mercenaries are slaughtered by the very men who hired them. For weeks afterward, crows grow so bloated from feeding on noble flesh that they can barely lift off the ground. This is the Battle of Crécy, the day medieval warfare died. The moment when nobility through combat was shattered by common archers, and the 100 Years' War truly began with France's most humiliating defeat. By the end of this video, you will see how a weapon worth 10 shillings destroyed armor worth 1,000 pounds, why French knights murdered their own mercenaries mid-battle, and how a blind king's doomed charge became one of the most tragic acts of honor in military history. Let's set the scene. Edward III of England had landed in Normandy with 15,000 men, pressing his claim to the French throne through his mother's bloodline. His army carved a path of destruction across northern France in a brutal chevauchée. Legalized plunder meant to expose the French king's inability to protect his people. After looting Caen, the English retreated toward the port of Calais. That's when the French finally caught them. King Philip VI had raised the greatest army Christendom had seen in generations. 30 to 35,000 men, including 12,000 heavy cavalry. Knights in full plate. Warhorses armored like tanks. Almost every great noble in France rode with him, joined by princes and kings from across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire sent contingents. The King of Bohemia arrived with his court. Even Moravia sent knights. It was a medieval Avengers assemble, united by one goal: English blood. For 500 years, the armored knight had ruled warfare. A fully equipped rider and horse weighed close to a ton. Trained from childhood. Armored with metal worth more than a village earned in a lifetime. Infantry existed to be crushed. Archers were nuisances. Real men, noble men, fought sword to sword on horseback. Edward knew his odds were hopeless. Outnumbered 3 to 1. Short on supplies. Exhausted from weeks of raiding. But he had one advantage the French despised. 5,000 longbowmen. Mostly peasants. Some criminals. All trained from childhood by law. In England, every Sunday after church, men were required to practice archery. Playing other sports was literally illegal. The longbow was simple, 6 feet of wood, but in trained hands, it was apocalyptic. A skilled archer could lose 12 arrows per minute at targets 250 yards away. The draw weight reached up to 180 pounds. The strain warped skeletons. Archaeologists still identify longbowmen by their deformed bones. Edward positioned his army on high ground. He formed his archers into a wide V for overlapping fire. Then he did something unthinkable. He ordered his knights to dismount. English nobles would fight on foot, beside peasants. Shock rippled through the camp. Men bred for the charge, whose horses were worth fortunes, now trudged into the mud with farmers and laborers. But Edward was clear. Only the living keep their honor. That night the English worked silently. Stakes were driven into the ground. Pits were dug. Strings were waxed against rain. Meat and ale were distributed so every man slept fed. Across the valley, French nobles drank, argued, boasted, and bickered over who would lead the charge. When dawn broke, rain poured down. The English quietly unstrung their bows and sheltered the strings under cloaks. The Genoese crossbowmen did not. Their strings stretched uselessly in the wet. When Philip arrived, he ordered his army to wait until morning. The nobles ignored him. Glory could not wait. The vanguard surged forward without orders, and the battle began not with strategy, but with pride. The Genoese advanced first, without their shields, without range, and without protection. Their bolts fell short. Then 5,000 English bows sang at once. 60,000 arrows per minute turned the sky black. The Genoese broke and fled. French knights rode them down. They slaughtered their own mercenaries for blocking the charge. Then came the cavalry. Wave after wave thundered uphill into mud, pits, stakes, corpses, and arrows. Horses collapsed. Knights fell. Armor turned into coffins. Arrows slipped into joints, visors, armpits, thighs. Impacts crushed bones even when they didn't pierce steel. When archers ran out of arrows, they pulled shafts from corpses and fired them back. The blind king of Bohemia ordered himself tied to his knights and charged into the storm. He was cut down instantly, sword still in hand. By nightfall, the French had charged 16 times. Philip himself was wounded and dragged from the field. The oriflamme lay abandoned in the mud. At dawn, the field was a graveyard. 1,500 nobles lay dead. 11 princes. Thousands of knights. The English lost 40 men. 1 English knight for every 750 French nobles. Chroniclers called it divine judgment. It was simply physics. Crecy destroyed the idea that noble blood meant superiority. It proved discipline beat bravery. Tactics beat tradition. Technology beat honor. The romance of medieval warfare drowned in that mud. France would repeat the mistake at Poitiers, and again at Agincourt. It would take a century to accept what that field revealed in one afternoon. That war no longer belonged to knights. It belonged to those who prepared. The blind king's charge became legend, the last flare of chivalry before extinction. And on that muddy slope in 1346, the medieval world ended. Not with a heroic duel, but with peasants calmly firing arrows into charging kings. If you're fascinated by history's bloodiest and most brutal moments, like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from.